Hello and welcome to another episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at a Hornby Black 5 that's been sent in to me by a guy called Rob. From what it looks like, unpacking it out of this box here, this Black 5 has been disassembled into almost its component parts. There's the tender chassis there and a bag full of bits. The loco chassis is missing parts and is loose with the wheels dropping out. And we found the tender body and the loco body, and we can see this is a weathered edition in British Railways livery. The whole Black 5 has been stripped down, the pickups there are all damaged, and there doesn't look to be any lubrication on this at all. It looks pretty dry, so we're going to have a look at what we've got now in this plastic bag and see if we can put it all back together. Hopefully most of the parts will be here, and as you can see on that homemade coupling there appears to be most of the screws that I need to put this Black 5 back together. So that's one major hurdle cleared already. Putting the screws in the magnetic tray there so I don't lose them. We find the underframe there for the locomotive. I think that could even be the tender one. And there's also a digital chip that Rob wants me to fit to this. There's this spring that has come from somewhere, and the pickups there and some pipes. There's also a footstep there which I believe has come off the tender rear. This model is going to take some work to get it back looking nice, but I am pleased that most of the bits appear to be here. So we're going to start off by just having a quick look under here, and the side rods, they're pretty bent in places. They will need to come off and be rectified. And this pony truck here, and you can see that fits in there, and it's got Rob's homemade magnetic couplings on it. The other coupling here clips onto the tender chassis. I'm going to start by attempting to try and get the motor to turn using the battery on the pickups, and it does actually turn. The motor turns that centre drive there, so at least the motor's not dead. So that's another hurdle overcome. It is just a case of reassembling this Black 5, hopefully. Well, at least that's what it's looking like at the moment. I'm going to start the rebuild by starting with the tender, which seems the easiest of the two to deal with. I'm going to unclip all of these wheels and give the pickups and wheels a good clean up, and adjust the pickups slightly as they do seem to be rubbing on the wheel backs, creating unnecessary friction. Going to get a cotton bud there with some mess on it and just rub it along the pickups and remove all the dirt and crud that has built up over time. Although, to be fair, this tender chassis looks to be quite clean and dust free. Once it's all been cleaned, I also give the wheel treads a clean and then clip them back into place. Apologies for the camera angle here. I had the camera stand set a little too high so you couldn't actually see what was going on there. Once the wheels are back in place, I'm going to clip the tender body shell back on, which is easier said than done. There's a lug inside the body shell that clips around the weight, and then it clips on and is held together with one screw at the back, which is located just behind that buffer housing there. For the tender rebuild, I did have to refer back to the service sheet because I just couldn't get the tender body on properly, and it took a while for the clip to actually engage with the body weight that's secured inside there. Once the screw's been replaced, I replaced the tender brake rigging that simply push fits into its locating holes, and then the tender body just needs a dust over with an old paintbrush, and then the tender is about rebuilt. Once it's all back together, I give the tender a roll test to make sure that the pickups are not putting up too much resistance against the tender wheels, and then I'm going to refit this tender footstep using a very small amount of Loctite superglue. You don't need a lot of superglue here, as the last thing you want is for it to bloom over the finished paintwork, and you'll have to go back to the drawing board and maybe even repaint the tender body itself. Holding it in place there with my needle nose pliers, the tender now is finished, and I can set that aside to dry while we tackle the actual loco. Now, the pickups on this model have been completely destroyed. They are bent and one of them is in two halves. So I'm going to start by stripping this model down even further to remove the wheels and the side rods, because these need straightening up, and also the cylinders there are slightly bent and that will need rectifying as well. To remove the side rods, you need to unscrew them from either side of the chassis block there. There are two small washers that sit on these screws, so ensure that you do not lose them if you ever remove the side rods off a Loco Drive Black 5 of this era. Once the side rods have been removed from the chassis block, you have to manipulate the base keeper plate there through the wheels as it is connected by a soldered wire. Once it's been manipulated free, the wheel sets will come away complete with the side rods. You can see now that I've also removed the motor from the chassis block there by unscrewing the motor mount, and I'm going to remove that drive gear because in between here is quite a lot of built up fluff and gunk, so I'm going to have to clean that out. The wheel sets are now laid out on the bench, and you can see the damage on the side rods, which I'm going to try and rectify using my needle nose smooth pliers. I'm just going to bend these gently back into shape, and hopefully if this works it will save me having to buy a new set to replace this set. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to use this contact cleaner just to give a clean out of the wheels and axles on the chassis block there, and I did that off camera. I'm also going to have to try and find a replacement for this spring as it's quite heavily damaged and is unusable in its current form. So getting my spare tub of springs out, I go through these to see if we can find one that will fit. It might not necessarily be a brass spring, but beggars can't be choosers as Hornby do not release this as a spare part. There's a whole myriad of spare springs in here and it took me a while, but eventually I did actually find one that fit. I believe it was off an old Lehman model, but needs must, and it doesn't conduct any electricity, so it was used in lieu of the brass one that Hornby supplied. Now we're going to look at these pickups and see if we can get these fitted back to the model. This pickup had been split into two, and just goes to show how thin the brass is that Hornby use. To repair this, I'm going to hold it together using my helping hands, and I'm going to solder a very thin piece of brass to the rear of it, linking the two bits together again, so hopefully we'll be able to reuse it. I can't get spares for this at the moment, so this is my only option, unless I want to make my own pickups out of some nickel strip, which is the last thing I want to be doing. I've also put some solder on the lugs there, just to make better contact, and as you can see the repair there is quite firm and is holding nicely. So I'm just going to flatten that down a little bit, and then we can go on to try and reassemble the pickups. I've also put a blob of solder on that pickup there, because this is one of the models where it relies on one of the pickups resting on a protrusion from the die-cast chassis. Now that I'm in a position now to start reaffixing this, I'm actually going to unsolder this wire off the base plate there, and I'm going to solder it directly to the pickup. Therefore it eliminates the ridiculous pressure fit of a brass part onto a brass rivet, which is reliant on passing current reliably from the wheels to the motor. These often fail, and I've done this modification on my own Black 5. Now I'm looking at the wheel set, so I'm getting my fiberglass pencil and I'm actually cleaning the wheel backs here, as they are heavily corroded and quite dirty, and these press on the pickups to provide reliable current, so it all needs a good clean-up. There's even some overspray of the weathering from the Hornby factory on the wheel backs, which is not conducive to good conductivity. I've found a spring there. It's not the brass original as mentioned earlier, but it fits and does a job. This fits onto a plastic axle keeper plate that holds one of the axles in place, and I believe is designed to push the rear axle down on the track so that all of the driving wheels are in contact with the rails at one time. But it makes it a right pain in the backside to reassemble the model, as you put the axle in and it just springs out all the time. And this spring is quite a soft spring. It's not hard, so it shouldn't be this difficult. Lining the wheels up there and lining all the brass bearings into the axle holes. Once that's done, I add a bit of lubrication and the wheels are all back in place, having been cleaned. The rear axle, as I said here, the brass bearings actually push into this plastic lug, so it's not the easiest thing to try and reassemble. Even here with this speeded up footage, it took me quite a while to get this to sit in correctly. Now as you can see, I've unsoldered that, so I'm going to need to reattach the wire, and I'm going to pass it through the hole here and solder it directly to the pickups that we repaired earlier. Just adding some slight lubrication there, some oil just to the bearings and the axles so it runs nice and smooth. And then I'll be soldering the wire back onto the pickup as I said. Well, that is after we've put some silicone grease on. I will get it in the right order shortly. It is important to re-lubricate the models after using the contact cleaner, as that does remove any residue of any lubrication, so there was none on this model at all. Holding that rear keeper plate down there, I have to keep my finger on it to stop the axle from springing up. And I actually put a couple of the screws back in place just to hold it down while I attempt to repair these pickups. Using my flat needle nose pliers again, I bend the pickups into the correct shape. And this was a fiddly job, as I had it in my mind that I didn't want to break the pickups as they'd been broke before. Putting them onto the plastic base plate there, some of the lugs which hold them in place had actually been broken off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold them in place with these needle nose pliers into where they should be, and then I actually heat them up with my soldering iron so that it melts the plastic just a tiny bit, and that holds them in place. I find this method works a lot better than superglue, as superglue will not adhere the brass and plastic together. You'll see here just how quick I touch the brass with the soldering iron. It really doesn't take a lot of heat to do this method, too much and you'll melt through the keeper plate, but just a gentle touch there on the brass to heat it up melts it into the plastic. It was on there for less than 2 seconds really, and then I repeat the process for the other one, and that pickup is now firmly in place and pressing against the lug that is present off the die-cast chassis. I also do the same on the other side once I've soldered the wire back onto the pickup there. This is a risky method, as I could melt that keeper plate altogether and then I'd have to buy spare parts, but I have done this before, like I said, on my own Black 5, and it improved its running no end. It runs now without stalling at all and picks up from all of the driving wheels just as it should. Now that that's all back in place, I'm going to screw the base plate back on. There you can see there, just under my hand, that the base keeper plate is slightly sticking up. That's because it's resting on the new solder. This isn't going to affect the operation at all, and it's not noticeable once the model is on the track and running around. Once all the screws are back in place, I'm going to turn the chassis over and ensure that the wheels are all free turning before I put the motor back in, and this will ensure that all the bearings are in the correct place and nothing is catching. We will then look at fitting the cylinders and the side rods back on now they've been straightened. And now that's running quite smoothly by lifting the motor out of the way. I'm happy with that, so we can move on to the next part of this rebuild. The screws, as I said, have got a small plastic washer on them to help insulate them against the chassis sides, and these just screw into each side of the chassis block. I refit the gear there that links the driving wheel to the motor and give it an oil up. Another test to make sure everything's running freely, and I'm going to remove some of this blue tack that's been placed on the motor here. I'm not quite sure why that's on there, but then the motor can be refitted to the chassis block, and then I give the drive worm off the motor an oil. Then I put the motor housing on one end and screw that back into place. There is also a motor mount that goes on the rear of this motor that screws into the chassis block as well. The screw goes in there, and then that fits on the back like that, and the rear of the motor slots in the hole in the back of this die-cast keeper plate. Tighten the screw up and the motor's back in place. I do feel like now we're making some progress on this rebuild. A quick roll and the wheels don't turn ensures that the gears are all correctly engaged. Now we can put the cylinder block back on and thread the side rods back into the corresponding holes on each of the cylinders, and then we'll screw this back in place. I did immerse this in some hot water off camera, just to soften the plastic, and manipulated it from its bent form before back into straight and true. So these side rods should go in better and the loco should run a lot nicer. You need to go gentle on this stage, as you don't want to bend any side rods and put yourself back a few steps. Once they're all back in place and they're fitting up, I screw the top back in and we're all good to go. Now I'm going to give it a quick battery test just to make sure everything's running nicely and there's no tight spots. And as you can see there, all the wheels with the battery are working, which is good. That means we've remedied the pickup issue, and we've also remedied the fact that the pickups were reliant on pressure alone between the wheels and the chassis. Running the chassis in on my rolling road there, whilst it's running, I'm going to use this fiberglass pencil to polish all the wheels up, and follow this up with the cotton bud and methylated spirits just to give the wheels a nice clean. Once all the wheels and wheel backs had been cleaned on this side of the model, I repeated the process for the other side. Once all the wheels have been polished up and are nice and shiny, it's time to refit the front pony bogie. Now this sits in place with a shouldered screw so that it screws in tight but allows the bogie to pivot left and right. I am amazed that all the screws are here for this Black 5. I did think I'd be having to buy a screw set for this, and it was just a case of referring to the service sheet to find out where they all went. Now that the bogey's been screwed into place with this flat-headed screw here, I'm just going to tighten it up, and as I said, it's shouldered, so ensure that the hole on the bogey there fits up with the shoulder on the screw, unlike I did there as it was too stiff. And once it clips into place, it should pivot left and right, as you can see there. Now I'm going to give it another final battery test before we move on to the loco body shell and fit the decoder. Giving it a battery test, you can see there that it's all running nicely, and I really am pleased we've managed to pull those pickups back from almost unusable back to running. The screw for the body shell though, I actually put back into the body shell so I didn't lose it and I knew which one it was. Before we refit the body though, I'm going to give it a good dusting over with this old stiff paintbrush, as there was a lot of dust on the running boards there. I do like the weathered effect on this model, which is unusual because sometimes factory weathering can be very over the top. One thing missing on the body shell is the smoke box door dart. There's just a hole where it should be, and it's obviously falling off in the past. So I decided to scratch build my own, and using my soldering iron and some nickel wire, just soldered a piece together with the help of my helping hands. Then trimming it to size, the nickel wire simply pushes through that hole in the smoke box there, and I'd put a small amount of Loctite super glue on it, and we've restored the face of this Black 5, as it did look odd without one. Once the glue's dry, I'm going to give that a touch up with some satin black paint, and we should be now on the home straight. Now that that's in place, let's have a reminder of what we started with and what Robert sent us through the mail. This Black 5 was already in pieces. It was totally stripped down with a bag full of goodies ready to be reassembled. Both body shells were loose, there was blue tack around the motor, and it was a complete non-runner due to lack of pickups. However, to my amazement, all the screws had been managed to be retained, and the only thing missing on the body shell was the smoke box door dart. This Black 5 really did look like a Barry wreck. And this is what she looks like now. Fully cleaned up, reassembled and re-lubricated with mended pickups and a new smoke box door dart, which I am very pleased with considering it's homemade. This Black 5 has been ready to return to Rob and been pressed back into service on his layout. I think you'll agree this has been quite the rebuild for this model, and I was at times unsure we'd get it going without expensive spares for this. I really do like the look of that homespun smoke box door dart on this Black 5. I'm going to leave you now with a few shots of the Black 5 having a test run around my layout before I finally ship it back to Robert. If you've got an engine you would like to see featured in a future episode of Trash to Track, or anything you'd like to be generally serviced or repaired, you can send it in. Please contact me at Dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, the email address you see there on screen. And I'll thank you all again for watching another episode of Trash to Track. I'm going to leave you now with some shots of Robert's British Railways Black 5 running around the layout with my own Black 5 in LMS livery on the opposite line on a goods train. Like I said, I'd like to thank you all again for watching. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.